I'm Cierra Bettens. Welcome to APTN News InFocus. This week, we're putting the federal election in focus. First, let's talk about the campaign so far.
I've just requested that the Governor-General dissolve Parliament and call an election for April 28th.
That was Prime Minister and Liberal leader Mark Carney on March 23rd outside Rideau Hall. The five main political parties have been working the campaign trail ever since. Threats from the United States and other foreign powers are, so far, dominating the campaign. But what have candidates been saying about Indigenous issues, from housing to water to free, prior, and informed consent? Joining me now to talk about what they've heard and what they're expecting to hear as the election rolls on are Dennis Ward, host of APTN National News, and Jennifer Laewetz, a political commentator and panelist on APTN's Truth and Politics panel. Dennis, Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us. Can we just start with the basics? So, Jennifer, what are some key Indigenous issues that are being talked about in this election?
It doesn't seem like there's been a whole lot of promises on Indigenous issues yet. Mark Carney did double the guaranteed loan program right before calling the election from $5 billion to $10 billion and expanded the scope, which seems like it goes beyond just oil and gas, which is nice to see. But so far, we're not seeing a lot of commitment around big issues like the child welfare agreement and the funding that's tied to it. Things like agriculture benefits, which is known as cows and plows. Those negotiations are ongoing. And there hasn't been a real commitment from any of the leaders on how they plan to continue working with our nations when they form government.
I would agree. I mean, I've not heard really one word out on the campaign trail so far. Our reporter, Angel Moore, tried to ask a question yesterday about sovereignty over fishing in the Atlantic there when Mark Carney was in Halifax and got kind of a non-answer there. That's about the first question I've heard so far on the trail. So,
So Dennis, as a host, you're covering these issues daily. I'm wondering, what are the things that you're hoping APTN will be able to bring into the discussion?
Oh, so many things. I love elections, so this is like the next 4 weeks. I am all about that. I'm hoping that we do in terms of our coverage for sure, but a little looking back too on the past 10 years in the Trudeau era and the record there. Whether you like it or not, the first thing that I remember thinking about is Freedom Road when Trudeau visited Shoal Lake 40 early in his tenure there as PM. I guess I remember it most because I got kicked off the island that day, but getting that, righting a wrong from 100 years ago and getting that road built and a water treatment plant and a school and everything that's gone on then. And, so I do hope we do some looking back because there was the national inquiry and so many things happened. I think it's worth looking back. In terms of the campaign itself, boy, it goes quick, 4 weeks. I hope we're going to get into some of the ridings. There's some interesting races shaping up. One here in northern Manitoba between longtime MP Nikki Ashton for the NDP, Rebecca Chartrand announcing last night she's going to be running for the Liberals. That's going to be an interesting one. I know Jen can maybe talk more about an interesting one out her way with a challenge to Andrew Scheer and whether that's a possibility that he might be unseated or not.
Yeah, over in Saskatchewan, the election is actually playing out really interesting because Saskatchewan in the last couple elections has been entirely conservative. And because of the boundary redistribution, which interestingly enough, some people were not happy with because the changes to the riding redistribution in northern Saskatchewan, because northern Saskatchewan is so isolated and so diverse land-wise that the entire half of the province is one seat. And when they were making those changes, I actually showed up to the Elections Canada meeting, and there was somebody from a local tribal council there stating, this is going to make things really tricky because you're essentially breaking it up. And now some of our nations are going to need to deal with 3 different MPs, and that's just not ideal. But they went ahead and did it anyway. But what they ended up doing was kind of gutting some of the rule in that northern riding that will make it easier for the Liberal or the NDP to pick it up, because it was mostly the rural folks that were voting in denser population. So it was held conservative by MP Gary Vidal, who is now retiring. And now there's a chance it's picked up by the NDP or the Liberal. So that's a seat to watch. And then in southern Saskatchewan, you have Chief Pegan, who is the former chief of Paskwâw First Nation, who was seeking the Liberal candidacy. I don't know if that has actually went through or not. I haven't seen much, but Chief Pegan is known as a strong leader. But the NDP and the Liberal are not showing up strong in Saskatchewan. My riding is, very, very Indigenous. There's a good number of First Nation communities. But as of right now, we don't have an NDP or a Liberal candidate even running.
Yeah, that's another thing I would point out is that, so many races don't have the candidates in place yet. So we don't even know who's running in some of these spots. Nomination meetings still to be held. I think the cutoff is not that far away, but some of these races are complete unknowns so far.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And, I'm also noticing that, a lot of the oxygen in this campaign is being taken up by, talks about tariffs and, the trade war with the US. But what are you eventually hoping to hear from the candidates?
I think I'm just looking to hear where they stand on multiple different issues. I feel like right now we are in kind of this really weird space where there is undoubtedly a coordinated effort from some pretty scary countries around the world, including Russia, that are actively undermining Western democracy. And I think one of the tricky things there is when we talk about First Nations sovereignty, I think a lot of the time we almost take a step back and say, well, how does this affect me? Is this a conversation I want to enter? But when I think of, attacks on Canada and attacks on our sovereignty as a nation, I also think of what the implications are on our nation to nation relationship. And when we have countries that are absolutely meddling with, disinformation campaigns, and they've already, invaded a sovereign state, which is Ukraine, I get a little bit concerned about Canada and also our relationship with Canada and even our Arctic. There's a lot of Arctic sovereignty. And I think that's why we're seeing leaders like Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney both made stops into the Arctic, into the north, and making promises around what they're going to do to protect our Arctic sovereignty. So I think that's going to be a big conversation in the next, few weeks on the campaign, is who is best suited to protect Canada. And really at the end of the day is when you're making that decision on who is best to, protect Canada and our sovereignty, that's also what's going to protect First Nations and our relationship with Canada.
Well, first, a couple of issues, I guess, that people have reached out to me that I'm unfortunately probably won't get traction. This year is going to mark the 10th anniversary of the release of the TRC. And there are some people that are hoping that would become a talking point for people in this election. I don't know that that's going to happen. Another group is calling for accountability on First Nations. They want the First Nations Financial Transparency Act to be something that's spoken about, bringing that back and making that mandatory. Again, I don't see that happening. Where Indigenous issues might come into play more, I guess, is when it comes to resource development and the impact of tariffs on that. Despite the stereotype out there for some that Indigenous peoples are against resource development and these types of projects, they're also the largest employer of Indigenous peoples in this country, and impacts on forestry could be big. When it comes to getting projects done, people have talked about Energy East again. Obviously, the Ring of Fire gets talked about a lot, and leaders in the business world, Indigenous leaders in the business world, have spoken about, times have changed since the last time Energy East was on the table. Companies are more aware of the fact that they need to be doing, consultation up front and including Indigenous peoples, First Nations in the resource development, resource revenue sharing. So I think things have changed a bit on that front.
Mm-hmm. So Dennis, earlier I know you also mentioned that our reporter Angel Moore asked the Prime Minister about whether he supported Mi'kmaq treaty rights, and he essentially gave a non-answer. I'm wondering, do you get a sense that these leaders are even ready to address or understand some of these issues?
I really don't. I sadly do not. I think this is a Trump election. This is a two-party election. Like we're seeing in the polls, the NDP is just getting bombed. Things could change. A lot of crazy things happen over a month-long campaign, but the issues and the parties seem pretty locked in at this point, I think.
Yeah, I think this election isn't really heavily focused on anything Indigenous related, unfortunately. It's, the 2015 election when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau won government. That was honestly, I think, one of the highest times for hearing about promises to Indigenous priorities. And I'm just not seeing that this time around. And there's actually been, almost like an effort to kind of skirt around it and not really get into the space of even wanting to have the conversation, because there are a lot of really big things happening right now that it seems like none of these leaders really want to address. And I'm not sure if that's what the reason is for it, or if it's just something that none of them really think that it matters. But I noticed Robert Jago had posted on Blue Sky a piece from the NDP because of one of their policy announcements about public lands, saying that they're going to unlock public land to build more homes. This plan will actually, from what he is saying, take the best pieces of First Nations land, like public land, and permanently alienate us from it by turning it into housing. And I think that's one of those areas where we have these political parties in Canada that always want to rush to the forefront, it seems, to talk about how they could do things better. But behind the scenes, when they're formulating policy, it's like they miss the mark completely, and they actually do things that are counterproductive to our success, to our sovereignty, to our land rights, and everything in between. And even right now, we're hearing about the First Nations Transparency Act coming back, because that was something that the Harper government wanted to see utilized. And then, Justin Trudeau had eliminated it. But now in the last 10 years, there's been more of a movement in the last 10 years than I've ever seen for grassroots First Nations demanding transparency from their band councils and demanding transparency. And it's almost this double-edged sword where you're in the middle of these sovereignty conversations, wanting to move away from the Indian Act, wanting to achieve sovereignty and full, economic prosperity. But on the other hand, it's like, whoa, bring back this government policy that's going to oversee our day-to-day operations, because we don't trust our chief and councils to be able to handle it.
Jen, when you bring up the 2015 election, Indigenous issues, I think a record number of Indigenous candidates were elected. There was a huge drive to get Indigenous voters out. Given that there's not going to be, it doesn't seem, Indigenous issues being spoken about, do you think Indigenous people are going to turn up at the polls?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. It's a very weird space. 5 years ago, talking about conservative politics, even with Indigenous people, seemed very weird. And it's very, very heavy in Saskatchewan. And that's really the only examples I have firsthand on the ground is talking about conservative MPs, because that's all we've ever had. And the vibe has always been kind of never vote conservative. I remember during 2015, it was ABC, Stephen Harper had to go because he was heavily, heavily controversial during I Don't Know More. But even now, we're seeing former First Nations chiefs running for the Conservative Party of Canada. I'm seeing former Chief Billy Morin, who was one of the youngest First Nations chiefs elected in Enoch history, running for the Conservative Party. I feel like even that environment is shifting, and people are starting to say, listen, it feels like we're on our own anyway, so who am I going to vote for that's best for myself and best for my family? And, you see the advocates online that are definitely, partisan in one way or the other, but then on the ground, the conversation is so different. And I'm hearing people I've never seen before ever support conservatives sharing my MP's posts on Facebook and talking about transparency and want accountability. And I'm like, whoa, what just happened? Because it seems like the narrative is shifting, which is concerning, because typically we view our belonging as a collective. It's a collective responsibility. We have a collective responsibility to each other, to the land, and now it's almost like, well, I'm going to vote for who I think is best, or I'm going to vote for who is best for me. And it's like our narrative and even our viewpoints are shifting so much that this election, I'm like, what does that look like? I come from a First Nation community, but I live in a city that's 50% Indigenous. So what is that going to look like at election time? And I'm confused, because this is the environment has shifted so much in the last few years that I don't even know where we're going from here.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm also remembering, back in January, leading up to the Liberal leadership race, Karen Pugliese, one of our reporters, wrote an article talking about whether we've entered this post-reconciliation era in federal politics. And I'm kind of wondering, what do you make of this, and what do you think are some of the underlying reasons that Indigenous issues are really getting put on the back burner in this election campaign and previously in the Liberal leadership race?
We talked about this on the Truth in Politics panel before Mark Carney was chosen. In the dying days, I would say in the dying days of the Trudeau government, there was a lot of announcements, Indigenous-related announcements. But if you go back to January, December last year, there were cutbacks to funding set aside for searching for unmarked graves. There was cutbacks to Jordan's principles. Things we were saying then that it looked like, reconciliation was in the rear view in terms of the Liberal government. And if people look back to the previous government, Stephen Harper's government, I don't know that they were ever in the front window.
I think part of the problem too is that everything is inherently political when it comes to reconciliation conversations around federal, provincial, and municipal politics. And as much as everybody really, really wanted to see the conversation around reconciliation advance, there are so many things that are playing into that conversation turning into the post-reconciliation era. And, when you saw Justin Trudeau get elected in 2015, the conversation of reconciliation was at the forefront. We were at the height of the TRC calls to action being released. And even since then, it's like the TRC calls to action have been slow moving and almost at a dead stop. But at the same time, on the other hand of things, at the end of the day, these federal and provincial politicians, they want what's best for them. They want what's best for their governments, and they want what's best for their political strategy to get reelected. And it is very hard for them to manage making big promises on reconciliation when you're seeing things almost take a turn for the worst in several different areas. Because, I went to a homeless strategy meeting in my city about a month ago, and the conversation around, especially Indigenous unhoused people, was so negative that at one point I had to actually go up to a mic, which is not something I do in a public forum like that. And I said, you know what? There's a lot of negative conversation around here saying, like, why aren't these First Nation communities taking care of their own people? What is going on? Addictions is getting worse. Our homeless population has doubled. And I would say it's 99% Indigenous people that are living on the streets in the city that I live in. But I went up to the mic and I said, you know what? On the other hand, guys, there is a lot of positive happening in the background too that we're not talking about. There is the child welfare autonomy. You're not going to see the results of that right away, but you are going to start seeing changes when First Nations now have autonomy over their own child welfare, prevention and laws and things like that. But on the other hand, when you have a government that is pouring funding into so many different areas and it's not targeted, then you're not going to see the results you're wanting to see. And that is one thing I would like to see out of these political party leaders is, okay, we do need funding in 1,500 different areas, but why not spend a year just completely, funneling money through pipelines to addiction strategies? Because we need that and we need that bad. And our provinces cannot manage it all. And our provinces do not want to pick up the tab in an area where they feel like it's not their responsibility. They feel like it's federal jurisdiction. So we need our premiers to come to the table and work with our new incoming federal government and come up with really good hands-on addiction strategies, mental health strategies, housing. You cannot stay sober and stable and healthy unless you have good, equitable access to housing and a stable environment. So there's a coordinated effort here that needs to be had. But I feel like it's really hard to sell that to the general population when they're going to come to the table and say, well, look at the last 10 years. We've poured a ton of money into reconciliation efforts. Where are we now and why didn't it work? And I feel like even our First Nations leadership are going to need to be very, very equipped in the conversations that they have and also the talking points they utilize to explain why this is needed and how we can move forward without, upsetting other Canadians that also feel like they're living in a state of crisis when it comes to the undermining of Canada's sovereignty and the cost of living and all of those things.
Yeah, one thing the Liberal government or any government, most governments don't do is they were providing all this funding, but I don't think they were listening to people on the ground. We would do stories on these, small groups that were doing these language programs and language camps and stuff. And I was like, oh, well, how much funding are you getting for this? And they're like, well, whatever we get from like bake sales and craft sales, like they're getting $0. Not that every organization wants to accept those federal dollars, but some that were doing great work were getting $0 when we're seeing these announcements of tens of millions of dollars, but nobody knows where it was going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dennis, Jennifer, before I let you go, I'm just wondering, is there anything you think is particularly important for our listeners to maybe pay attention to this election?
I think mostly just the sovereignty piece. How our leaders, our political party leaders in Canada plan to not just advance Canada's sovereignty, but I'm not hearing a lot about the defending of our rights either, because our inherent and our treaty rights should be directly tied into that conversation, because anything that undermines our country undermines us. And it feels like we've been almost on the back burner. And especially during this election, it just hasn't seemed like it's been important. And, we've been hearing a lot about social issues, addictions, mental health, poverty, even missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people, where, we found some of our women and their remains uncovered in landfills in Manitoba. And it's like, how is this not being used as the perfect opportunity to talk about what our federal government is going to do to support our provinces and support our leadership and making sure this never happens again? And it just seems like they're all in a completely different space than us. And it feels like we're being left out of the conversation entirely.
Yeah, we're seeing political organization after political organization putting out statements, saying treaties are not mere historical documents here. Sovereignty, nationhood, these types of things, they want them on the table. And I don't know that it's going to happen in this election. And I don't think the mainstream media is going to push those as issues in this election either.
All right. Well, Dennis, Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us and giving us some insight into this upcoming federal election. And yeah, looking forward to checking in later in the campaign.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And be sure your listeners tune in for our election debate coverage as well as election night coverage on APTN.
Jennifer Laewetz is a political commentator and panelist on APTN's Truth and Politics panel, and Dennis Ward is the host of APTN National News and the host of that panel. Election Day, in case you haven't heard, is April 28th. You can tune in to APTN's election coverage on APTN National News, which airs at 1 p.m. and 6 p.m. Eastern Time, or by visiting aptnnews.ca. This episode of InFocus was produced by Mark Blackburn and Charmaine Straker, with editing by Jesse Andrushko and hosted by me, Cierra Bettens. If you're enjoying the show, let us know by leaving a rating and review. You can find more APTN podcasts like APTN News Brief and Truth in Politics on aptnnews.ca/podcasts or on your favorite player. Thanks for listening.
Hello, I'm Rick Harp, host of APTN News Brief, a daily podcast version of the nightly broadcast of APTN National News. Available on all major podcast platforms, APTN News Brief is your quick way to hear the headlines every weekday morning. Learn more at aptnnews.ca/podcasts.